Hola, muchas gracias por venir. A continuación, Víctor Palacios, curador de la Casa del Lago, tendrá una conversación con Dannielle Tegeder. Influenciada por los dibujos técnicos mecánicos que utilizaban para sus trabajos los miembros de su familia en su infancia, Dannielle Tegeder, residente de Brooklyn, New York, trabaja con instalación, animación, sonido, dibujo y pintura abstracta. Su trabajo se plantea desde estrategias conectadas al posminimalismo y la abstracción del siglo XX, como un constante desarrollo de un vocabulario visual que viene de datos arquitectónicos, demográficos o matemáticos. Actualmente, Dannielle es profesora asociada de arte en Lehman College en la City University de Nueva York y exhibe en ZsONAMACO Sur a través de la Carey Secrets Gallery de Chicago.
So, good afternoon, buenas tardes. So we're going to begin with a format where I'm just going to show images for 20 minutes, and I'm going to move fairly quickly because we just have about 20 minutes for those. And then Victor is going to ask me questions. So it's really great that we can have an intimate kind of conversation, and we'll end with about 20 minutes for questions and so forth. So I'm going to jump in. So as mentioned, I'm from New York. I'm actually from New York too, which is a little unusual. Most people in New York are from somewhere else. And I start with this image because my studio is in the middle of Times Square in New York, which is a very bizarre place to have a studio, as you can imagine, but it really factors a lot into my work. So I think a lot about cities and architecture, systems. So being in the middle of making my work in the the center of Times Square is really kind of stimulating and interesting. I also I love Mexico City, and I've come here for the past 10 years. I'm married to someone from Mexico City. So it's really interesting also just being in another kind of really large system as I think of them. I'm just going to situate you and sort of show you some images of my studio in New York. So these are works on paper, and I have a solo project here, as they mentioned in the the solo project section with Carey Secrets Gallery, and there's a lot of drawings in the booth. So I work directly on the wall like this. I draft them mostly, and I'm just showing you some materials. I usually work, gouache, ink, colored pencil. This is me working. This is my 6-year-old daughter, so Estela. So she comes and drafts after school as well. And I'm just going to begin with some references. This is an image from early 1970s in New York City. It's Trisha Brown, who's a choreographer. So I think a lot about taking drawing and painting out of a very traditional format on the wall and kind of extending it. And I think I just love this image. It's in Soho, the kind of height of the art in Soho in New York. And I love this line kind of moving off this architecture. And then I move into, this is Eva Hess, Mona Hatoum. So I really think of these as drawings in a lot of ways, even though they're sculptures. Fontana. This is an image that is Mark Lombardi, who is an artist in the 90s in Brooklyn, who unfortunately died tragically, but he would make these, and very young, he would make these gigantic systems, political systems. And after 9/11, the FBI actually came and confiscated all of his files because they were so they were so detailed in a way. He actually made many connections between all these political and kind of social economic situations. So I think a lot about also systems and invisible systems around us, and kind of making those connections. And they are, in a way, about architecture, but they do become also metaphors for other things of how we are all connected to one another. And I'm just going to move into, I have 5 sections, and I'm going to move pretty quickly. But the heart of my work are these drawings that I've made for the past 10 years. And I think of them as, these are plans for utopian cities. And so these are quite large, and forgive me because I'm terrible on my Mexican measurements, but they are probably about the size of the wall behind me. And they're all drafted with kind of archaic architecture tools, levels. They're all works on paper, ink, graphite, gouache. And within them, and I'm going to move, like I said, pretty quickly through them, there is a vocabulary that I've developed over the past 10 years of different parts and elements that create a city. So I think of these, like if you look at this kind of cage system in the middle, I think of that as a headquarter rotunda. Or there's always, you know, on the other side, this area that's organic, and I think of that as an expulsion area. And they are, you know, in a way, it's about building a utopian place. And of course, you know, utopian places fail, so they always have this edge of they're constantly failing in a sense. And I also say they're completely not populated at all. So I think of them as plans. And of course, they also reference abstraction. So I did want to show just one of my titles, and the titles become legends to read the work. So there's a list of all of the elements that are in the drawing. And you see this Bakra Patachi. I play a lot of language and writing games where I cut apart all the cities in India and Iran, and I've reconstructed them into fictional city names. And that also speaks to changing borders, failing cities. I always say that I'd make a terrible architect or urban planner because I'm just interested in utopian places, failing cities, cities that don't work, cities that cannot be built, things like that. Oops. This is a painting. So I don't have paintings in the fair, but I also spend about half the year making paintings. And a lot of my work is also about the idea of translation. So as I was saying, I do a lot of conceptual writing and poetry, and I think a lot about what happens when you translate a language, and what do you gain and what do you lose. And it's kind of wonderful for me to be here in Mexico and to kind of think about that, even in moving from English to Spanish and back. So this painting was translated into a sculpture. And this is a mahogany and glass sculpture. And I should also say that I don't really hang my paintings in a traditional way. This painting was hung very, very low, and the sculpture laid right in front of it. So it really, you really have a relationship with the 2D into the 3D when you're walking through these. And that really happened because I started doing many wall installations about 5 years ago. And I'm going to move into that. Just showing you some references from this, like a Lisitsky. This is a Zaha Hadid building. This is a post office in Poland. Can you believe it? I'd be at the post office every day if it looked like this in New York. Lisitsky, it's kind of amazing to me that this is 1923. So I think, again, a lot about abstraction that moves into installation. It's really incredible. And here I am on my first wall installation. So as I mentioned, you know, the work is a lot about architecture, and about 5 years ago, I received I got the invitation from a museum. This is the Chelsea Museum in New York to do a wall installation. And I showed up in the space, and much to my chagrin, there was this column that had not been on my floor plan. And coming from being a painter where I really controlled everything in the studio, this was not, I was obviously very frustrated about this. And you can see me working with a team here. But it really became, it really majorly changed my work, because it became, for the first time, me interacting with the actual architecture, and also the first time that I could walk into my drawing. And I'm just going to go through a few of these. This was at Lombard Fried Gallery in New York. It was done outside. This is a Marcel Breuer building in New York City. So I work with the elements when I come in, the constraints of the architecture. And some other things that go on with the wall drawings that are very different than my studio practice, and I probably split half the time now I'm doing installations and half the time I'm doing drawings and paintings, is I go into an area or a city, and I usually work with the community or the school. And, you know, I gather materials sometimes from that place, but I'm working again with the kind of constraints of the architecture. This is a Machado and Silva building that was just built in New York City, or up in upstate New York, rather. And the signature of this building were these long, thin windows in the corner. And this was a 80-foot wall drawing. I don't really know how to translate that, but it's really enormous. And looking out that window, that I'm going to show you this image, it was very green and upstate. So again, my work is about exposing the outside and then bringing that inside. And I also think about the invisible systems within the walls of the building. And I should also mention that, you know, my family in New York are all steam fitters, and there's going to be no way at all to translate that into Spanish, except that maybe I could say that they work in the trades. And that means that they drafted enormous plans for the inside of buildings throughout New York City. And so a lot of the drafting comes from that, but also that we would go on construction sites growing up. And so I think a lot about the inner architecture, almost the hidden architecture, I think, of buildings. And when I lay down a wall drawing, for me, it's almost about exposing that. And I'm just going to show you quickly, this is a sound and drawing project, and I do have a number of these here in the fair. Obviously, there's a reference to Kandinsky. This is how they're installed. So this is a 5-year-long project. It's still going on. And where I made 300 drawings, and then I worked with a programmer to create a piece that translates the drawing into sound. So again, it's a lot about translation, and it's a definite constraint. It's not something like the yellow feels this way and it changes in every drawing. It's really a very tight program that when the drawing is fed through, it translates to it. This is it being played, so they become like short animations. And you know, with 20 minutes, I don't have time to play these, but they are on my website if you want to see them. There's 7.5 hours of sound, so I'm the only one who has heard all of it, but there's a lot of them up. I also do animations, and this was projected on the side of the museum at night. So again, for me, the wonderful thing, all the projects and the mediums that I work in feed back into one another. And after working on the wall drawings, the wonderful thing about the animations is, again, I can project it very small, or it can be projected on the side of the architecture of different spaces. So that's been a really flexible, interesting, medium for me. This was a recent project I did, an in-process wall drawing. These are just construction references, theater. So this is the beginning. This is how we just finished this project, and it was at the Hartford Art School in Connecticut. And I went in to work with the students. I was a visiting artist for the semester. And this is how we opened the show. So I've gotten increasingly interested in the performative quality and the process of the wall drawings. So of course, the wall drawings are all painted over, so they're very ephemeral. So I decided to really show that experience. And every week I went to the gallery, and there was a 2-day session. So this was like the week after that. Slowly develops. So it's the end of the project. It went about 6 weeks, and it was really an alive drawing. It brought a lot of people into the gallery, and really, I again worked with the community of that space. And I'm just going to finish with some recent installations. This is a wall drawing that is then connected on the other side to these deconstructed installations that I've been doing. So, and this is something that is similar to what I have in the fair this week. So I work again kind of thinking about painting, sculpture, drawing, and working with the architecture. And this was a recent piece that was just finished as well in Chicago. And again, what happens is I go into a city and I gather materials. And what happened that was interesting in Chicago is all these planks came out of the Field Museum, which is a very old historic science museum. And they were from the 19th century, and they were donated to me. So it really kind of involves the materials of that area. I'm going to finish with that. this week, just to say something quickly about the installation that I have here, I've spent all week in Mexico City gathering materials. And what's been really wonderful for me here is to gather all this glass. So there's a lot of glass in the installation, if you go see it. And I'm really in love with this glass because this is something that you cannot do in New York. And it's been sandblasted and worked on. So again, it's about also attaching myself into a city. I've been gathering materials in downtown, and I've worked with a team of Mexican assistants. And so I feel like I'm like a tiny bit Mexican now after surviving this process. But again, I just want to finish with that and say thank you again for coming. And I guess we'll begin the conversation with Victor. Yeah. You have one.
Thank you very much, Dannielle. And congratulations for your work here at the fair. I would like to start with one provocative question. And that, why are you still framing your works?
Why am I still framing my works? That's a really interesting question, and this is something that the gallery and I, actually, we went out to dinner the other night, and we were discussing this, because we were discussing painting in Mexico and painting in New York, and maybe if there are differences or not. For me, that core work, which are those early paintings and drawings, and I shouldn't say early, because I continuously make these in the studio, these are almost the plans for everything that I make. So I feel like they contain the information as a plan for everything. So, I like the way there is that contains. I also feel like, quite honestly, I thought a lot about painting in that way, and I still feel like traditional painting that is hung on a wall like that can be transgressive and still very interesting and still hold a lot of meaning. And so I kind of continue to do, I also like the contrast, I should say, between showing the traditional format like that with the installations. Because the work is about quoting that sentimentality of modernism, if you will.
I think that's very interesting. The contrast between the expanded painting or in the expanded field, and the traditional or modernist way of showing it. But I would like to know, how did you get related with abstract art in the first time, for the first time?
I think there's two answers for that. I think that there is the answer that, I went to art school and I did my MFA at the Art Institute of Chicago, and I've always loved abstraction, right? So when I started art school, I was traditionally trained, but I was always interested in abstraction. That was my thing, and I was so fascinated by Malevich and all the constructivists, and also how I felt like abstraction could hold all this political meaning. I just thought that was so incredible. But I guess, the more personal answer to that is a little bit of what I talked about before, that I was trained by my family to think about systems and to draft building, like insides of buildings. So this type of drawing and painting, although I went to art school and it's obviously contextualized within modernism, and I look at a lot of contemporary abstraction and historic abstraction, it also really has a very personal connection, that how I was trained to make these drawings and paintings is not from 7 years of art school. It was really from my father and my uncles, and a trade that was passed down. My family immigrated from Ireland, and those trades are full of Irish immigrants. And so there was a craft that was passed down to me, and I would have become a steam fitter if I was not a girl. But around 12, I realized, so this is kind of what happened. So I think those are the two. There's this kind of intellectual, artistic side of that, and then there's a really kind of personal, emotional side to it.
Okay. And do you think the avant-garde movements related to abstract art, like constructivism, suprematism, and some others, do you think they were a failure in some way?
Well, I think yes. I mean, I think those movements had such a utopian impulse in them that there's no way. Of course, they failed, right? You know, that constructivism was supposed to set apart like a whole complete revolution, and it did in some way, but of course it didn't in many other ways. So I think painting, essentially, I say this to my students, and I direct an MFA program, I say, painting is about failing. Like, it is about, you have a utopian impulse when you make a painting, and essentially it fails. Like, and we all know this if you've made a painting. You wake up the next day and you know the next level in your work, right? So I've made 5 of these installations, you know, and I know what the next level is now. Like, now the spaces are getting more, there's more gradation and stuff in them. So I think painting is about that, you know, not only abstract movements. It's about kind of having an excitement and, I don't want to say a disappointment, and then moving to the next level.
But would you agree that it's totally different to make painting or abstract art nowadays than it was 100 years ago, with this whole impulse and this whole belief of mixing art with life? And so why do you think we are still interested in abstract art?
Well,
which is the...
Yeah, that's another excellent question. And, you know, I did a project last year that was called The Workroom for the New Constructivists. And this was a project that I started seeing all these young artists, and I'm counting myself as a young artist, by the way, so making work that was referencing particularly constructivism and suprematism from all over the world. And I was having conversations with curators about this. So I did a 6-week-long project where I invited many of those artists in, and again, this is on my website, and we did collaborative projects together, and we had discussions about abstraction, about political and social, you know, situations within abstraction. Can abstraction still hold those meanings? So yes, I think a lot of artists are deliberately quoting those time periods in abstraction because there's so much unrest. And and also I think, you know, painting continues to evolve, right? So I'm including like the image up as a painting. I should say that, like, even though maybe this is not paint, there's a little bit of paint in it, for me, this is about painting, because I'm trained as a painter and I'm trained formally. So it continues to evolve. I think a lot about, like, why make a painting now, you know, when you walk in and you have video and your phone and everything else. And so for me, that's another reason why my painting has shifted into working, because it works in context to the world, essentially, and to the internet, and to systems, and to cities.
Talking about cities and machines, just in the entrance of the fair, I don't know if you notice, there is the smart booth of the car. And right now, there are some guys doing a sort of wall drawing that is incredibly similar to some of your works.
Oh my God, really?
Really. We can go when we finish this. And, well, this is to mention that abstraction has also moved to other areas of cultural production, including design and mercadologic aspects. And how do you feel about this abstraction being almost like a commodity, like something? Yeah.
Well, for me, I mean, I think obviously about my work a lot with design and modernism, furniture design in particular, things like that. So I don't necessarily commodify that in my mind, you know, but I do think about the history of those movements and how, you know, it's interesting, like I've started making these installations with hiring industrial designers and furniture designers, not artists. And so because I feel like, you know, the work has shifted so much, it's not about a painterly organic line. So I love that porousness. I think that that's what's happening with painting. It's kind of opening up, you know, into video, into design, into all of these different mediums. Absolutely. And I love that abstraction is not just about a small collection of people and existing just in the studio. I love it that it's existing out in the world, essentially.
In your book, you make a difference between, I would say, formal projects or formal production and conceptual project. Why? Isn't it the same thing?
I've been asked this before.
Yes?
Yeah, you know, my catalog is divided that way, and I think that, you know, I have this whole side life of writing, as I mentioned, these conceptual poetry projects, and for me, they are simply about ideas. There's not a real aesthetic. They're not about aesthetics in any way. You know, they're about ideas and collecting text. And of course, there's probably some connections with systems, and maybe they're getting tighter. But for me, the ideas are much more important in those works and how the aesthetics of how they look. So the catalog was divided that way. The curator decided to kind of add them, which actually I was quite against, because I have this very separate life as a writer, and I don't even talk about it in the art world. And in New York, it's big enough that we don't even cross paths. But it's still kind of separate in a way, but of course there's these connections in how I gather text.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit more about your actual relation with materials, different materials? You were talking about that you were like walking in the city trying to find out different materials, but how do you work with the symbolic aspects of materials, the materiality, because I saw that there are many, well, for me, new materials in your work here, so it's like...
Well, that's a really exciting part of making these installations, and actually I think a really exciting part about going to a new city and making an installation. So, as I mentioned before, like just to tell you a little bit about my process this week, I gathered a lot of materials downtown, but I went to a 200-year-old glass factory in the center, and they were able to sandblast lines into the glass. Of course, like, this makes me completely ecstatic, you know, because it's just, this is something that you cannot do in New York, definitely, and probably not in Europe. There's just access to materials here for artists. But I also want to talk about, like, the social aspect of, you know, interacting with the community and the city when I go into a place. So this means that I am spending a week talking with people and buying materials, and I'm usually with assistants from that area. So it attaches me. I have to move through the city in a very different way than if I went into my studio and stayed very safe, right? It means I have to go out into the city and I'm socially interacting. So there's something very interesting for me about that, and it's messier, right? Because things happen, and, you know, my glass didn't show up for 12 hours, and I was kind of freaking out about that. But it's all in there. It's not something that can be controlled, and I love that. Just to comment on the symbolic and historic nature of the materials, and you can see, especially in this image, obviously I am thinking a lot about modernism, furniture design. I use that palette directly, but one thing that I've started using is this wood, and I think that starts to directly connect into a lot of furniture and a lot of design from that period. So it's used definitely on purpose, and that's something that I can't do just in my paintings. So it brings in that whole history of that movement by quoting these materials, which is interesting.
Would you say that your work is site-specific?
Well, the installations are absolutely site-specific. So I would say, you know, aspects of my work are site-specific. You know, I continuously do site-specific projects. And I love that. I love working in different architectural spaces or on the street. But I have to say, I also love being in the studio in an intimate space and also making these drawings that have a plan. They exist in two very different ways, in that the installations are completely ephemeral, that they only exist like a performance for a month or 2 months, and then they're destroyed, you know. And so there's a performative aspect to making them and in gathering the materials, but they don't exist the way my paintings and drawings do, where they endure. So there's an added urgency to it, and sometimes I love that, and sometimes actually I have trouble with that, you know, that they get taken apart. But it definitely adds, I will say, I'm excited by it. I'm not bored by it, because there's always something happening when I go into a site-specific space that the walls are different. There's a social, I'm working in a museum or a space, so I'm interacting again. It's messy, you know, it's not like you're safe in your studio and with materials that are unexpected in many ways.
What's the difference for you between working in a museum or art space and a public space?
Well, I think, you know, in a museum or an art space, I'm having, you know, most of the people in there have some kind of art education, so I'm having a lot of conversations about modernism, abstraction, contemporary abstraction, installation. So I think that it lands probably more in that conceptual part of the work. But I also love working on the street and in places where it accesses other people, because I am from a family that are all workers and craftsmen. So I can talk that talk in a way. And they can talk that talk very well, because it's about materials and making a plan and about crafting things. So there's two different conversations that happen. You know, it's interesting for me when I was making this, there were a bunch of carpenters there, and they know, you know, the carpenters, of course, like they immediately know what wood I'm using, what period this wood is from. And that's always really interesting for me. It's the same thing with the glass factory here. You know, like just to watch these like people like being able to really craft this glass is really so beautiful to me. And I love having that conversation as well. And I think that crosses a lot of different classes and a lot of different things. So I think there's a lot of different conversations that happen in those different spaces.
Thank you. An obvious question, what do you think about Mexican muralism?
Mexican muralism. I don't think a lot about Mexican muralism, but I do think a lot about what's happening in painting in Mexico is always in context to that, right? And that's always interesting to me, kind of what's happening here in painting, and I watch that a lot because I come here a lot, and I think that there's a lot of new things that are happening in Mexico in painting, finally. I feel like in some ways there was a real reaction in Mexico to that. I just don't have that relationship because my, you know, my references were not muralism, right? I just was in Chile last month, and I was so, you know, of course, I'm so enamored by all the constructivism through Latin America, and that's become such an influence because now I've spent so much time here. But my references were never like that, you know, through school. It was just a completely different, it was a very European, it was like Mondrian, Lisitsky, Kandinsky, you know, Moholy-Nagy. So it's interesting to add that for me, you know, in many ways.
All those works in New York or in Europe?
Well, I see a lot of those. You mean a lot of the European references? Mm-hmm. Well, you know, my studio's right by MoMA, so it is kind of incredible. You know, I can walk over and see like an incredible Mondrian or something. But of course, you know, I think most of us experience this through images now, I mean, including myself, you know, even if you're down the street from a museum. But I think it's also just about the context of, you know, when you're in Latin America, you're learning much more about constructivism, Latin American constructivism, and I feel like that's finally coming to New York, but we are late in the game, for sure, you know, in that.
And what about American abstract painters? You don't normally mention them.
Well, you know, we were talking about this last night at dinner, that one thing that Mexico has done for me, and like I said, I've been coming here for a decade and spending a lot of time here, is that it's made me realize how rooted I am in American abstraction, but especially the abstract expressionists. So my professors were, you know, the students of most of the abstract expressionists. I came, you know, when I went to school, that's really what enraptured me, you know, like it's very romantic, but you know, I loved all of those paintings, and of course they're very large, and it's about using your body in them. So that was definitely like my introduction into being what I thought being an artist was, right? So that maybe that's become a little sentimental now, and there's a lot of other references there, but I do feel rooted very much in that tradition of American abstraction, but especially New York abstraction. You know, I go to LA and I feel more out of sync in Los Angeles than I do here. I feel actually more connected to Mexico. So.
Okay. When I see your latest works, I kind of see the possibility of doing it, transforming it to a more performatic field or participatory with the public. Mm-hmm. Do you?
Well, I was very against this for a long time, as you can imagine, right? Because I would make my paintings in the studio, and I would then go into installations, and I was like, didn't want anyone near me making the installations. But after making this project in Hartford, the one I just showed, I have to say it was really interesting, because there's something about showing something in process. You can enter the work that is in a very different way that you can't after it's finished, right? And so and of course, because the work's ephemeral, it lends itself to just showing this performance through it. And it's funny because, you know, I like I said, I work with these teams of people, and of course, everyone is Instagramming and photographing like every minute when we're on an installation. And so I have tons of this documents, and looking at it after, it has kind of given me this like, wow, it is really wonderful to see like this performative element. So it's happening. I just did that project. I would definitely be interested in doing another project. I have to say, though, it really keeps me on my toes. It's not, you know, when you show up and you're doing a participatory painting or something, it's very different than finishing a project the way you want and then opening it, right? Because anything can happen. Which is the good and maybe challenging side of it. But I think it's there. It's definitely emerging, perhaps, in the work.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your writing practice?
Sure. So, for the past 10 years, I have been doing a lot of, as I mentioned, conceptual writing, and I do call it poetry, but I would say in no way is it any kind of it's not narrative in any way. It's not rhyming. It's very, very abstract. So one of my pieces, it's a little bit like gathering materials, maybe. One of the first pieces is called New York City Falling Apart, and I was walking along in New York, and a bucket of cement fell off a building in front of me into a car in front of me. So what I did is I collected text from the past 50 years and lifted it out of newspapers. So every story is set, it's a 2-sentence story, it's set in the middle of the page, and it is about something falling from the sky in New York. And all sorts of things have fallen from the sky. It actually changed my relationship to being in New York, because it made me look up. And there's a whole life happening up. So that's on UbuWeb. I think some of you, was published in something called the Unpublishables, and that's Kenny Goldsmith runs that, and so it was published as in that way. You know, I do a lot of different conceptual projects in that way, and I do readings sometimes and things like that, but very, I would say, extremely experimental poetry, where mostly I'm lifting text. And of course, I am interested somewhat in the visual layout of it.
But if you are so related with text and writing, why don't you take it to the paintings, to the installations, to the because well, in the Russian avant-garde did it a lot, no? So have you thought about that possibility, or is something totally like
Well, I'll tell you where it connects and why I started writing is I started making my titles, and it was 1 paragraph, 2 I was starting to have 5 paragraph titles, much to my chagrin of my gallery or curators who don't like this because it doesn't fit into their press release or something. So, it's just the writing was getting so extensive. It just naturally led me into writing. But I will say again, I have kept it as a really separate practice, and I'm not quite sure why that is, except that in New York, the writing world and the art world has gotten so large that there's almost no crossover, right? So I participate in the poetry world, publishing things, writing, but I almost never see someone from the art world. And I do feel like that is very different here. That's one thing that I love about Mexico, that I feel like I'm up against people there's writers and artists and musicians. I feel much more of a crossover when I'm here, actually. So I don't know, maybe it will evolve into connecting, but it's definitely, they're still somewhat separate. Go to questions.
Creo que estamos a tiempo, ¿no?
Sí.
Okay. Bueno, muchas gracias, Dannielle.
Sí, gracias. Are we going to do questions? Sí.
¿Alguien quiere hacer una pregunta?
How are we doing in time? Yeah, we have about 10 minutes for questions. So if there are any. Yes.
A little bit he was asking about how text was connected in the Russian avant-garde to graphics. I also see how a lot of the Russian avant-garde graphic artists were doing a lot of furniture too, or even ceramics and stuff like that. And since you've been talking about incorporating wood and other furniture elements, I was wondering if you would ever be interested in crossing over to design and adding a utilitarian aspect to the aesthetic you already have going on, because it's pretty strong and it looks like it has that potential to go over very easily.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I didn't mention the Bauhaus, who, of course, is, they worked in all medias and definitely had a utilitarian basis in it. I think it would be interesting to collaborate with maybe a furniture designer. I'd be open to doing something like that. But I guess it's a little bit, it's like my cities that I make. They fail, and I somehow like that they don't work. And I think maybe it's the same with me making sculpture or something. I like that there's not a utility, that it peaks at maybe a furniture or something like that, but that somehow it fails in its sense, that it references that in your mind. But thank you. Yeah. Are there any other questions from anybody?
Hi.
Hi.
How did you go into architectural concepts?
How do I utilize them or think about them?
Yeah.
So, my interest in architecture, like I said, I'm from New York, but I moved to Chicago to do my MFA. And I spent 10 years in Chicago. And those of you who know Chicago, it's such an incredible city for architecture. I think much even better than New York. And it's really, I feel like, the best city for architecture in the United States. And so for me, that's really where I got interested in architecture. And I look at, again, I don't just look at contemporary abstraction. I'm looking at contemporary design, contemporary furniture, but definitely contemporary architecture. And of course, I have a lot of conversations with architects. There were 3 architects last night here at the fair. I had really interesting conversations with them. So for me, it's interesting, going into that, Machado and Silvetti building, I was the first artist to go into that building. That was a contemporary museum that they bought, and I was lucky enough that they were doing site visits when I was doing this installation. So it was really kind of a wonderful conversation between an architect and me about, I was telling him that I'm referencing being outside, bringing this in, and he said, well, that's why I made that window. I was thinking about that as well, and I love that crossover in many ways. And I love the constraint of the architecture, that I go into a place and it's site-specific, and I have to work against what the architect has laid out, right? So it's that becomes an interesting conversation for me, whether the architect's there or not. Bea, you done? Okay. So I just want to say thank you to everyone for coming, and thank you so much to Victor for doing the talk. And please stop by the booth if you're walking around. It's Z. It's in the solo projects, and it's Carrie Sechrist, which is they're from Chicago. So ZMS20. Very good assistant. So thank you so much.